I think we should ask ourselves first, what are really the aims which society requires from a financial system? And I think we can basically simplify it to two. The first would be to allocate capital to the real economy and to do it in a cost-effective and efficient way, supporting long-term development and sustainable growth. And the second would be to manage risk, because if you undertake any economic activity, it has uncertainty. If you build a new road, you don't know what the geology will be, you don't know what the market will be. If you start an SME, you don't know what the risks are in terms of marketing and so on. So there is real economic risk related to uncertainty. And one of the functions of the financial sector should be to manage that risk, reduce it. Now, I would argue that particularly in the developed countries, in recent times, and previously in the developing countries, the financial system did neither. Because instead of managing risk, it created risk. In fact, we can talk about pure financial risk, as Thierry was so eloquently saying, with these trillions and trillions of derivatives, where instead of minimizing or reducing risk, risk is imposed by the financial sector on the rest of the society in search of short-term high profits for the sector. And that, bad in itself, bad for income distribution and so on, is particularly bad because it contributes to creating crises. And the second is a more permanent problem, is that it does not allocate capital efficiently from savers to investors. And we just heard from Craig how high, almost $1 trillion, was the cost of the rescue of British banks. There are other estimates, like the Bank of England's Andy Haldane calculated that in 2009 alone, over 100 billion is a subsidy of the taxpayers to the banking system. And the US is being calculated by Bloomberg with IMF data to be spending $80 billion a year on providing this implicit subsidy. So it's a very costly financial system, and it doesn't properly finance the real activities, SMEs, green economy, infrastructure, and so on. So do we need a very different financial system? And I think the answer, which probably everybody here would agree with, is a resounding yes. I think that one of the important issues we need to do is to be radical. I'm not personally a very radical person, but as the Americans say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if it is broke, do fix it, change it. You cannot continue with this current system. And one key issue, I think, is to restrict or isolate speculation. And Thierry took us through very clearly about what is trying to be done and how it's being eroded. And I would pose to you a sort of radical, even more radical position. What if we try and dramatically reduce speculation? If we shrink the part of the financial sector that is, as Lord Turner so clearly said, socially useless. And we have also the thinking of Professor Elizabeth Warren in the United States, who argued that financial products could be a bit like drugs, medicines. So if a new medicine is going to be introduced, the Federal Drug Agency looks at what are the benefits to the patients and to the surrounding society, and what are the risks. And only if the benefits outweigh the risk do they approve that particular medicine. So maybe we should think about something like that. If a derivative is helping an exporter of wheat to hedge his price, that's fine. It's performing an economic function. But if it's only a super derivative so that some hedge fund can make a lot of money, it is not fine, because it's only generating money for that particular person or persons, and it is generating and it could be generating systemic risks. So I would argue that what we need is a financial system that is smaller, simpler, and less opaque, and that is the aim that we should try and pursue. I want to very briefly talk about the historical context. The first point I want to make is that there is a broad point that the financial system does not have to be like that. We can have a proper financial system that serves the needs of the real economy. It's not that complicated. Technically, if we can overcome the tremendous power of the financial sector. After the massive crash and Great Depression of the 1930s, there was a major re-regulation of finance, starting with Glass-Steagall that separated investment and commercial banking. And there were, after that, practically no crises in the next 40 years. During the post-war period, post-Second World War, there were practically no crises because the financial system was well regulated, was small, was simple. Afterwards, there was a major deregulation and liberalization in the 1980s, started among other countries here. And as night follows the day, as Shakespeare said, as soon as you have a major deregulation and liberalization, you start having crises. We first had them in a massive way throughout the developing world. But now we've had them in the most sophisticated financial markets, the so-called North Atlantic crisis. This is not a global crisis. This is a crisis of the North Atlantic, of Europe and the United States. Most of the developing world, because they've learned from previous crises, have actually got quite good regulation, and they have not had crises. I looked recently at Africa's record in the last 10 years. There's been only one major banking crisis. Are they more clever than we are? No, they've learned the lesson from previous crises, and they have good regulation, and they have simpler, smaller financial systems. We keep telling them that they should have large ones and sophisticated ones, but they shouldn't listen. So we must stop the situation where crises have become the new normal. In any year in the last 20 years that you look, there have been major crises. This is not a sustainable situation. So what are the major challenges for regulation? I don't have time to talk about in detail, but I think macroprudential regulation is a very important element because finance, as Craig said, is very procyclical. It is very prone to boom and bust. So it is very important to have good counter-cyclical regulation, which will take away the punch bowl when the party is at its best, as a former Fed chairman said. That is, which will moderate the growth of credit in the boom times. We need comprehensive regulation. We have to regulate everything that is meaningful, and including shadow banking. Whenever something quacks like a duck, it has to be regulated like the duck. Because we have a finance system that's very clever at creating functions and institutions and mechanisms that are not well regulated, precisely to avoid that. I think counter-cyclical regulation can be done via capital requirements, via provisions, and by loan-to-value ratios, which are stricter in the boom. If we think of Northern Rock in this country, Northern Rock, at a time of peak property prices, was lending 125% of the value of the house. And that is completely crazy. And I was a little bit worried when I heard a recent presentation from the Bank of England, where they have advanced a lot on counter-cyclical regulation, but they said that the loan-to-value ratio was not going to be included in the counter-cyclical provisions because it was considered at the moment to be too political. So if in this country you don't curb how much you lend against the value of a house, you're almost setting yourself up to another property bubble. And we know that the countries like Canada, like Hong Kong, that have put limits on loan-to-value ratios, and even more have varied them countercyclically, have not had property bubbles and have not had crises caused by property. So we actually know the formulas. We know what should be done. But the main problem is the politics, and that is why it is so important to have meetings like this and coalitions like this one, who will take the lobbying on the concrete issues that Finance Watch is fighting, that some people in parliaments are fighting, to regulate the financial system and to shape it in a way that will serve the real economy and not the speculators. I will have one more point, because I do represent half of humanity, although I'm the only one speaker on the panel. And I want to make a point about public development banks. And this is that where markets fail, I think governments need to step in, need to act. We know there are these massive market failures. We cannot get private banks to significantly finance renewable energy, SMEs, and so on. And we see countries where successful public banks do a great job. I think one of the lessons that is not often made from Germany is that the KfW, Credit für Wiederaufbau, an institution which is now the second largest commercial bank in Germany, highly successful, is a public bank and funds very successfully SMEs and the transformation to green finance. This is a lesson from Germany that I would like to learn, not the austerity lessons we're getting preached from the German finance ministry, but I would like to learn their fantastic banking system in many aspects, and also, of course, the more regional Sparkassen that Thomas will talk about. We have the BNDES in Brazil, financing innovation, financing SMEs, financing great infrastructure. We have the European Investment Bank in Europe. And of course, we have the banks in China and India that have financed their development so efficiently. What are the advantages of development banks? One of them that we have seen in the crisis is that they can do major counter-cyclical lending in the crisis. When private banks stop lending because they're afraid to take more risk, then public banks have been stepping in Germany through the EIB, in Brazil, in China, to lend to maintain economic activity. Secondly, they can fund a strategy of development. You don't have to go and beg, as we see here people begging, RBS, which is more than 80% owned by us, the taxpayers, to please lend to SMEs. No. The German finance minister phones up KfW, the Brazilian one, phones up BNDES and says, lend more to SMEs, lend more to the green economy, because they have an instrument. It belongs to them, and they can articulate an efficient development strategy. Finally, public banks, can leverage public resources in a very effective way. And I want to finish just by saying that I think a significantly scaled British investment bank that could fund growth in this country would be very effective. Thank you very much.